vests.
Yeah,
And,
the engineers' environment, though, is so much soot and stuff from the soft coal that invariably they couldn't put their best.
but their style was
jacket
overalls. And,
Yeah.
They had bib overalls for the most part, and denim jackets,
Yeah.
and
Maybe a scarf around
striped
their neck.
caps and a bandana, the famous railroad bandana to keep the coal dust from
that's
going
right.
down the back of your neck. Oh, sure.
The mogul here, I have a note saying.
Yeah, this once again was packed on the siding, and I think it was probably a Saturday or a Sunday, and it was just waiting for a train to go by before they were able to get into Beverly Station. And this is, I call it the Bass River siding, because the Bass River is right down.
Yeah.
Below
bank.
there,
Yeah.
No, and that picture, again, was a 1939 May 30th affair, and the next one is June 19, 1939. Again, Harold, you were awfully busy with that bellows camera.
Well, I wanted to try to get so many of the different locomotives that came in the area, and I could do this very nicely in Beverly and Montserrat area without, this was before I got my license, and my mode of transportation for a lot of these was one bicycle.
Yeah.
So,
What may I ask turned you on to this type of photography?
I guess I always had a love for engines and stuff, and these were so massive engines compared with even automobile engines and stuff that you couldn't help but really look at them and admire what they are.
Did you have any idea when you were taking these pictures as a youngster that they would be become so valuable as the years went on?
Well, I was hoping that I had my own darkroom, so I also developed my own film and printed my own work. So I washed the stuff good, and the negatives held up pretty well. There's probably a few that are a little dusty, but
well, we can't say, Rich, how indebted we are to.
Indeed,
Harold
I mean, before these turned up, there were maybe half a dozen, maybe a dozen at the outside, pictures of steam trains in Beverly, and they were kind of catch-as-catch-can, box camera snapshots, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And these are exquisite.
34, we're now looking at the depot again, 1939, Harold.
yeah, this evidently I wanted a full side view of this, and you see that that massive shaded area in the foreground?
Yes.
That was from the water tower.
Oh, that's the shadow of the water tank.
Yeah, and when you see the building at the extreme left, you will read on there, "Home of Weiner Brothers," and then the news place was right about here, and then Angie's was the bigger building background.
I have a feeling that we missed something when we
didn't
failed to get to Angie's.
Angie's, and yeah, that's.
I think I was taking pictures along Park Street.
Okay, next we continue with Harold's series here. June 21, 1939, Harold.
Yeah, this is, once again, I call them afternoon shots because the sun laid on the locomotive just the right way so you could, get a decent photograph. And this one happened to, I walked around and got a slightly three-quarter view, but...
Yeah. Once again, what was the significance of the number painted on the side of the cab there? That just
sequential. The engines of the 3600 class, there were almost 100 of them.
I see.
And they started out at 3600 and went right up through 3699.
I see.
And there was a little tiny number up the top of the locomotive number which showed the division that it was in, like NH would be New Hampshire.
This, I believe, says TP, which was Terminal Portland.
Yeah. And then underneath was the class.
Right, this would be a P2.
And the familiar Boston and Maine decal on the coal car, water car.
You might also notice that the bell is in mid-swing here, which means that the engine is already moving, and the bell is ringing.
Yeah. Okay. We're again at the depot, June 21, 1939, Harold.
Yeah, we seem to take a lot of, well, I guess there were quite a few Pacifics. It went right up to...
They were the mainstay of commuter traffic, sure.
Mainstay when I was photographing anyway. Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about some of that equipment?
The plumbing, the plumbing on the side. Yeah, this might be a good
Let's
spot
do that.
because most of these engines have something like this, and people are probably saying, "What's all that stuff hung on the side there? What are those things?" Okay. Well, splitting the running board in half in front of the cab are two major pieces of equipment. The forwardmost piece is actually a Worthington feed water heater, and what that did was preheat the water, the cold water coming from the tender behind the locomotive where it was stored. And that was to heat that water to some degree before it was injected into the boiler under pressure so it wouldn't kill the steam pressure by having cold water go into the boiler. The mechanism directly behind the feed water heater is a Westinghouse cross-compound air compressor. And that unit was run by steam and actually pumped up the air for the train brake lines. And the air from that compressor was forced through the small tubing under the running board and then stored in tanks underneath the frame of the locomotive, and in this case up in front of the boiler. There's a tank underneath there, and the air was actually stored in those tanks. And when the engine would be stopped at the station, quite often you could hear this, the thump, the thump,
right.
And that would be the air compressor still working, pumping up the air after the brakes had been used. And you could hear it exhaust out through the smokestack.
And up above that, top dead center, right in front of the cab, was the generator. It generated electricity.
That's right, turbo generator. It actually used steam to spin a small turbine and create electricity, which made electricity for the locomotive lights, and in some cases even the car lights too, where you had older wooden cars with no batteries. They had a conduit that plugged in, and the locomotive generator actually powered the lights in the wooden coaches. Later on, the big steel cars had their own generators underneath them, running off a belt from one of the axles on the wheels. And then the electricity was stored in large storage batteries under the cars.
I think right to the left of that is the safety valve, and right now it looks like she's blowing.
Yeah, it's lifted off.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, I don't know about you fellows, but when I was a lad of about 5 or 6, and my granduncle Ed used to take me down to the Beverly Depot, and we'd see these trains coming in from the Gloucester crossing direction, heading south. They'd come around that curve, and I well remember breaking out into a few tears with that monster coming at me, hissing and blowing and spouting.
Scary things.
And
That's
you know, they were quite a sight to see.
And I think if you were somewhat near the crossing, sometimes the engineer would open the pet box and give you a little side shot from the valve there. Yeah.
I can remember also that you had a wave of heat as the locomotive went by. You could feel the radiant heat, and you could smell that combination of soft coal smoke
and steam.
Hot steam and cylinder lubricating oil all mixed in together, and it was you'd never forget that. You never forget that.
Maybe that's the thing that attracted us.
Yeah, I think I was 12 or 14 when the last steam ran through Beverly, and thank God, because this generation knows not.
Yeah, true. Amen, Rich. Amen. Okay, Harold, you're on again. July 3, 1939.
Okay, this happens to be another Pacific, but it's heading towards Salem, and as you can see in the left in the background is the gas tanks along River Street, and I think you can see the chimney of the depot too. And this has a cylindrical feed water tank right up in front of the smokestack.
That was called an Alesco style feed water heater, Alesco being the company which manufactured it. And it was a bundle type feed water heater. And this would have been the same sort of unit as was tucked along the running board in front of the air compressor on the locomotive that we were just looking at.
That's right. And you can see the air compressor doesn't have that other.
That's right. Yeah. And again, one was not necessarily better than the other. They were just two different ways of doing the same thing, preheating the cold water from the tender by the use of exhausted steam before it was injected into the boiler so as not to knock down the steam pressure.
Okay. Again, July 3, 1939. which, by the way, Rich, was the year I was born, 1939.
Aha.
So
Got a couple of years
there
on
we
it.
go.
Yeah.
Beverly Depot, Harold.
Yeah, this is a mogul. It has a couple of passenger cars, maybe 3. I can't tell. Maybe on the negative it shows all of them, but this is heading towards Salem, and it's a train. It isn't one that comes right from Portland or
Yeah.
Portsmouth.
It's strictly a local.
Yeah.
I have a note here that says you might have known the engineer, Lewis Chandler.
Oh, I don't. It looks something like him, but Lewis, when I knew him, strictly had Pacific locomotives.
Okay.
And Louis, he liked young fellows who were interested in railroad, and it was against all rules and regulations. But when he went to Rockport, he said if we met him down to Montserrat Station, he'd say, "Okay," and this is after the conductor waved and went back in. He says, "Okay, come on up." and once you get up there, you know, you thought you were going to just, you know, have a thrill of a ride. Yeah. He says, "Well," he says, "if you're going to Rockport, you got to earn your way." He says, "Find out how to open the door and throw the coal in. Learn something about this thing." So I fired it to
You did.
yeah, all the way to. And then later on in his trips, he let me sit up with him in the
Right on the seat box?
yeah, and I handled the brakes and the throttle.
What a thrill! Huh? What a thrill that must have been.
That was.
What a thrill! They wouldn't do that today. They couldn't do that today,
No.
really. But
And it wouldn't be as much fun if they did.
Absolutely, absolutely. Tell me this now: when they converted from the steam engine to the diesel, did they have to do anything to the track, to the bedding?
No.
No, I don't think so.
No.
They didn't have to do any.
They had some pretty good bedding.
I see.
You can see this is
Same track, same
yeah.
same rail.
Actually, what you might want to say is that they were able to allow the track to deteriorate because steam tended to pound the rails because of the dynamic motion of the pistons and the rods going back and forth, and the engine would tend to be doing this all the time because the pistons are going opposite one another. So the section crews were always having to realign the rails.
Yep.
Well, when diesels came in, that no longer happened, and track would stay aligned much longer, and they found out they could do less maintenance on the rails, and the diesels were much more forgiving machines as opposed to the steam engines.
I see. Well,
And I think after the diesels come in, and they did do some track renovation, they got rails a quarter of a mile long, and they put them in and welded them together, and they had a different attachment. Instead of just the plate that the rail sets on and the spikes going down into the ties, they have kind of like a spring clip, and this compensated for the expansion in the summertime and the contraction in the wintertime.
I see.
And also this pounding action of the trains going over it, whereas the spikes, when this would happen, would actually get
Pull
jacked up and it had to be kept being pounded back in again. Now you've got a big, essentially a big spring, I mean, of metal this big in diameter, and that flexes as the track goes up and down and stays tight. So it's a whole new ball game today.
Amazing. Okay. Next item, Rich, there's a story, and a sad story.
Yeah.
that goes
A sad
with this.
story.
Sad story.
Would
Yep.
you explain here? We're looking at Beverly Depot, July 3, 1939. It's one of Harold's pictures, but you might tell us the story, Rich, of what happened here.
This is number 3666, and anyone that knows locomotives on the Boston and Maine, that immediately calls legend to the fore. This particular locomotive was on a run to Maine in September of 1939. It was a turnaround run where they went up to someplace around Berwick and then came right back again. And in the length of time it took to turn around and start back on September 10th, 1939, by the time they got back to the wooden drawbridge over the Piscataqua River between Portsmouth and Kittery, the bridge had been weakened by some construction going on a new bridge next to it. And on the trip back, one of the cables anchoring a caisson in the river had sawed through one of the wooden pilings on the trestle and weakened it enough so that when the locomotive passed over it, the trestle collapsed. And 3666, her coal tender, and the baggage car behind, all 3 units went into the river. And the locomotive engineer and firemen were drowned. And the baggage master, by sheer stroke of luck, happened to be in the first coach behind the baggage car talking with the conductor. So he wasn't in the baggage car at the time, and so was not injured. As soon as the air brake lines parted, the brakes came on automatically, and the rest of the train slid to a stop on the edge, the very edge of the uncollapsed part of the trestle. And the interesting part of the story is that the locomotive was deemed a total loss and was never removed from the river, and to this day remains under about 30 feet of water in the Piscataqua River.
Well, Harold, you may well have taken the last picture of this engine.
It may be.
Yeah, that was only 2 months.
Yeah, I didn't
before the
know
end.
it. I didn't know it.
We're at the Gove Lumber Company siding, Montserrat, down the street from Bertram Street, home of Harold Boothroyd, August 9, 1939.
If I can get it, it'd be pretty
That's
good.
a mouthful, Rich.
There it is. You couldn't say that again.
I got to call it the right name, Shifter.
Shifter, that's right,
Yeah,
Shifter.
that's what the B&M calls it. This picture was taken, probably right about opposite Sherman Street, which is usually, it goes in and out of Gove Lumberyard, and then it stops and goes along the main line.